The laptop industry just had the most consequential 2-month stretch it has seen in years, and if you blinked, you may have missed the full picture of what actually happened. In early March 2026, Apple walked into what has historically been Google's territory and dropped the MacBook Neo at $599, a price point that nobody who follows Apple expected to see with an Apple logo attached to it. The device landed with an A18 Pro chip, a 13-inch liquid retina display, 16 hours of battery life, and a build quality that reviewers immediately compared to machines costing twice as much. Google watched that happen, watched the coverage accumulate, watched the Chromebook's defining advantage, which was its price, get attacked directly by the most valuable consumer electronics company in the world, and 2 months later responded with the most significant rebranding of its laptop strategy in 15 years. On May the 12th, 2026, at an event called the Android Show, Google officially unveiled the Googlebook, and Apple, which had fired the first shot, now had something to react to. To understand why the MacBook Neo was such an aggressive move, you need to understand what Apple has historically refused to do in the laptop market. Apple's lowest priced laptop before the Neo was the MacBook Air, which typically sits at a starting price of around $1,000 to $1,100 depending on a configuration. That price positioned Apple's entry point in a category far above the Chromebook's natural market of budget-conscious students, first-time laptop buyers, and cost-sensitive institutional purchasers like schools and government agencies. For 15 years, Google's Chromebook owned that lower price segment with relative comfort. The Chromebook never seriously threatened Apple's MacBook line because the two products were not competing for the same buyers. The MacBook Neo changed that calculation in a single announcement. Apple launched it on March 4th, 2026, alongside the iPhone 17e and the M4 iPad Air, and at $599 it was, in Apple's own words, the most affordable Mac ever built. For education buyers, the price dropped further to $499. Apple had not just entered the budget laptop segment, it had entered it at a price point below what most consumers expected to find a MacBook at, and it had done it with silicon that put the machine's performance in a completely different category from the Chromebooks it was now directly competing against. The A18 Pro chip powering the MacBook Neo is the same processor that Apple used in the iPhone 16 Pro in 2024. That context matters enormously because it means Apple is putting smartphone-level silicon efficiency, thermal management, and neural engine capability into a laptop chassis that costs less than many mid-range Windows machines. Apple's own testing claimed the MacBook Neo was up to 50% faster for everyday tasks like web browsing compared to the best-selling PC laptop with the latest Intel Core Ultra 5 processor, and up to 3 times faster when running on-device AI workloads like applying advanced effects to photos. The machine came with a 6-core CPU, a 5-core GPU, a 16-core neural engine, 8 gigabytes of unified memory, and 256 gigabytes of storage in the base configuration. The battery testing Apple conducted using pre-production systems showed 16 hours on wireless browsing. The design came in 4 colors: silver, indigo, blush, and a new citrus. It weighed 2.7 pounds. Apple Intelligence features were included. The machine had 2 USB-C ports, a 3.5mm headphone jack, a 1080p FaceTime camera, and side-firing speakers, supporting spatial audio. Reviewers who got hands-on time with the device before the March 11th availability date consistently used the word surprising in their write-ups, not because the hardware was unexpected from Apple in qualitative terms, but because the price at which Apple was delivering that hardware was genuinely unprecedented. The Chromebook market that the MacBook Neo was targeting was not a marginal category. Chromebooks had captured a dominant position in the education sector. Over a decade of sustained deployment, particularly in American K-12 schools, where the combination of low hardware cost, minimal IT maintenance requirements, cloud-based workflow, and automatic software management made them the default choice for large institutional purchases. By some estimates, Chromebooks accounted for more than 60% of all laptop purchases made by American public schools during the height of their adoption period. Google had built an entire educational ecosystem around Chrome OS that included Google Classroom, Google Docs, Google Slides, and the broader Google Workspace for Education suite, tools that the institutions buying Chromebooks in bulk had fully integrated into their instructional workflows. Millions of students from elementary school through college grew up doing their schoolwork on Chromebooks, which created a user base that was deeply familiar with Google's cloud-based workflow even before they entered the workforce or purchased personal devices. The consumer side of the Chromebook market had been more competitive, but similarly anchored around the price advantage that no other major laptop brand had seriously challenged for the better part of a decade. What Apple was attempting with the MacBook Neo was not simply to sell a cheap laptop. It was to make the price argument that had always kept Chromebooks in their lane no longer decisive, while simultaneously offering the software ecosystem, the brand recognition, the build quality, and the vertical hardware-software integration that Apple is specifically known for. The reaction in the technology press was immediate and pointed. Macworld published an analysis arguing that Google had essentially helped Apple sell 1 million more MacBook Neos by revealing a Googlebook product that could not clearly differentiate itself from Apple's newly competitive offering at that price point. TechCrunch described the MacBook Neo as Apple's colorful answer to the Chromebook, and the phrasing was deliberate because it captured what Apple had done. It had answered a market question that Google's product had defined on Google's own terms, with hardware that Google had no comparable response to at the time of the MacBook Neo's release. Google's response, arriving 2 months after the MacBook Neo, was the Googlebook announcement at the Android show on May 12, 2026. The event was presented by Alexander Kosher, Google's Senior Director of Android Tablets and Laptops, and it represented the most significant strategic repositioning of Google's laptop ambitions since the original Chromebook launched in 2011. The Googlebook is not merely a renamed Chromebook, it is a fundamentally different product concept built on a platform that merges Android and Chrome OS into a unified operating system, with Google's Gemini AI model serving as the intelligence layer that runs through the entire experience, rather than appearing as a discrete feature you access through a separate application. Google described the philosophical premise of the Googlebook in a phrase that its product team clearly spent considerable time crafting. Computing is moving from an operating system to an intelligence system. That framing positions the Googlebook not as a computer that has AI features, but as an AI that happens to run in the form factor of a computer. The 4 primary features that Google demonstrated at the announcement define what Googlebook actually means in practice. The first and most conceptually ambitious is Magic Pointer. On a conventional laptop, the cursor is a passive instrument that moves where you point it and activates where you click. On a Googlebook, the cursor is a Gemini interface. Wiggling the cursor over content surfaces, contextual AI suggestions based on what is on the screen. If you hover over a date mentioned in an email, the system can create a calendar meeting around that date without any additional navigation. If you select 2 images, such as a photograph of your living room and a picture of a sofa, Magic Pointer can visualize how the sofa would look in the room. The ask, compare, and combine functions built into Magic Pointer represent an attempt to make Gemini ambient in the computing experience, rather than requiring the user to deliberately open an AI interface. Whether this works as fluidly in daily use as it does in a keynote demonstration is a question that cannot be answered until the hardware ships in fall 2026. The second feature is Create My Widget, which extends an Android feature of the same name to the Googlebook desktop environment. Users describe a widget they want in plain English, and Gemini builds it by pulling data from connected Google applications, including Gmail, Calendar, and various web services. Google demonstrated a travel dashboard widget that aggregated calendar events, hotel reservations, countdowns, and weather information into a single customizable desktop element. The third feature is Cast My Apps, which allows users to open Android phone apps on the Googlebook screen, functioning similarly to Apple's iPhone mirroring capability on the Mac. The fourth feature is Quick Access, which lets users view, search, and insert files from a connected Android phone directly on the laptop, without requiring manual file transfer. Taken together, these features describe a device whose value proposition is heavily dependent on the user's existing investment in Google's ecosystem. The Googlebook is most powerful for someone who uses an Android phone, stores files in Google Drive, communicates through Gmail, schedules through Google Calendar, and navigates through Google Maps. For that user, the integration promises to be genuinely seamless. For someone outside Google's ecosystem, the features are considerably less compelling. Every Googlebook device will carry a hardware identifier called the Glowbar. This is an illuminated LED strip on the lid of the laptop, styled in the 4 colors of the Google logo, that Google has described as both functional and beautiful, without being fully specific about all of its functional applications. The indications from Google's own marketing materials suggest the Glowbar will serve as a notification indicator, a charging status display, and a visual signal of Gemini activity. It is the most physically distinctive design element announced for the platform, and it serves the brand function of making a Googlebook immediately recognizable at a distance in the way that Apple's backlit logo once served for MacBook identification before Apple discontinued the illuminated logo in 2016. 5 manufacturers have signed on to build the first generation of Googlebook devices: Acer, Asus, Dell, HP, and Lenovo. Google confirmed that every Googlebook will pass a certification process covering processor, memory, storage, and keyboard specifications before receiving the name, analogous to the stricter version of the Chromebook Plus certification model, No pricing has been confirmed. No specific chip platforms or model names have been announced. Google declined to confirm whether it plans to release a first-party Googlebook alongside the manufacturer devices, with its VP of Devices, John Miletus, stating only that he could not comment on first-party hardware roadmaps, a phrase that technology journalists read as neither a denial nor confirmation. The fall 2026 launch window is the only firm timeline Google has provided, with more details promised before the devices reach store shelves. Google also confirmed that Chromebooks are not being discontinued, that existing Chromebook users will continue receiving updates through their current support commitments, and that some Chromebook models may become eligible for a transition to the Googlebook experience as the platform matures. The relationship between Chromebook and Googlebook is therefore additive for now rather than a hard replacement, which preserves Google's installed base in education and enterprise while giving the company room to build the premium tier that the Googlebook is intended to represent. Here's the pivot. The market context that frames both of these products makes the competitive dynamics unusual. Apple released the MacBook Neo into a hardware pricing environment that was already hostile to consumers. DRAM prices had surged dramatically through early 2026, making memory upgrades significantly more expensive. Component costs across the PC market had risen sharply. Apple, with its vertically integrated silicon design and manufacturing relationships, was able to price the MacBook Neo at $599, partly because the A18 Pro is iPhone silicon that Apple produces at enormous scale, amortizing the design cost across hundreds of millions of units before a single MacBook Neo was sold. The same pricing dynamics that made the MacBook Neo possible are a structural advantage that no Android laptop manufacturer can easily replicate, because building a custom high-efficiency chip at the scale required to reach a similar price point requires the kind of vertical integration and multi-year silicon investment that only Apple has consistently executed in the consumer laptop market. The identity question that analysts have raised about the Googlebook is pointed and specific. The Chromebook succeeded because it was ruthlessly simple. It had a clear value proposition that any buyer could understand in 2 sentences. It is inexpensive, it starts instantly, it maintains itself automatically, and it handles the browser-based tasks that constitute the majority of what most people do on a computer most of the time. That clarity was a competitive advantage in a market where Windows laptops came burdened with setup processes, update cycles, driver management, and software ecosystems that demanded ongoing attention from the person using them. The Googlebook's value proposition is considerably more complex to articulate. It is Android and Chrome OS unified into a platform whose final name Google declined to confirm at the announcement, referring to it only by the codename Aluminium OS before clarifying that this was not the official branding. It is premium, positioned above the Chromebook's traditional price band, but without a specific price to make that positioning meaningful for buyers doing actual comparison shopping. It is AI first in a market where AI first has become a phrase that consumers are beginning to encounter with skepticism as often as excitement, having watched Microsoft invest billions in making Copilot the centerpiece of Windows 11, and then watched Microsoft roll back those integrations after a consumer adoption rate of approximately 3.3%. The Googlebook is asking users to believe that the AI integration they are being offered in 2026 will be meaningfully more useful than the AI integrations they have encountered on other platforms and largely ignored. Whether that belief is earned or whether it reflects aspirational marketing more than shipped product capability will be determined entirely by how well Magic Pointer, Create My Widget, Cast My Apps, and Quick Access work when an actual user with an actual workflow sits down with a Googlebook for the first time and tries to accomplish something they care about. The gap between a feature that works beautifully in a keynote and a feature that works reliably in unpredicted daily use is where Google's most ambitious product launches have historically lost their momentum. Apple's competitive position following the Googlebook announcement is, counterintuitively, stronger than it was before. The MacBook Neo had already established itself in the market with 2 months of sales, reviews, and retail presence behind it. By the time Google unveiled the Googlebook on May 12th, the MacBook Neo had been available in stores since March 11th, had generated weeks of positive press coverage, and had built up consumer awareness that Google's product, still without a confirmed price or specific release date beyond fall 2026, could not match in the near term. The MacBook Neo runs macOS, which gives it access to the full library of native Mac applications, including professional-grade creative tools in the Adobe and Final Cut ecosystems, productivity software, and development environments that Chrome OS and Android have historically not supported at native performance levels. It runs Apple Intelligence, which processes certain AI workloads on device using the A18 Pro's 16-core neural engine without requiring a cloud connection or an active internet session, giving it a meaningful advantage in environments where connectivity is limited or where users prefer not to send their data to external servers. It has Touch ID in the higher configuration at $699. It carries Apple's established track record of long-term software support, with MacBooks typically receiving operating system updates for 6 to 8 years from the date of release, a support lifecycle that Chromebooks have historically matched through Google's guaranteed auto-update policy, but that Android devices have rarely sustained. At $599, the MacBook Neo is priced at a level where the Googlebook, once pricing is confirmed, will face a difficult calculation. To undercut the MacBook Neo on price, a Googlebook manufacturer would need to deliver the Gemini native experience and the Glowbar aesthetic on hardware that costs less than Apple's A18 Pro machine, which, given the component pricing environment of 2026, is a challenging target. To match the MacBook Neo's price and argue superiority through AI integration alone, Google needs users to believe the Gemini experience it is delivering is categorically better than Apple Intelligence at the same price point. That is a hard argument to win against a company that has spent 4 years building its AI infrastructure into custom silicon. Google's history with premium hardware is also a factor that the Googlebook will need to overcome as it builds credibility in a market segment above Chromebook pricing. The Pixelbook, Google's last serious effort at a premium first-party laptop, launched in 2017 at $999 and was eventually discontinued in 2022 after failing to build the commercial momentum that would justify continued investment. The Pixel Slate tablet followed and met a similarly difficult market response. The Pixelbook Go, a lighter and less expensive follow-up, fared better in the budget to mid-range segment but was eventually retired as Google consolidated its hardware strategy. The pattern those products established was one in which Google excels at defining a premium concept and building technically impressive reference hardware, but struggles to sustain the long-term commitment to software support, retail presence, and accessory ecosystem that transforms a compelling laptop into a platform that buyers trust for multi-year ownership. The Googlebook's multi-manufacturer launch strategy, with Acer, Asus, Dell, HP, and Lenovo all committed to building devices, partially addresses the sustainability concern by distributing the commercial risk across established hardware partners rather than concentrating it in Google's own hardware division. But it also means that the Googlebook experience will vary across manufacturers and configurations in ways that the MacBook Neo, as a single unified Apple product, does not. Consistency of experience is one of the areas where Apple's approach has historically produced user satisfaction that multi-partner platforms with the same branding struggle to replicate. What the 2-month sequence of MacBook Neo and Googlebook reveals is that the consumer laptop market is entering a genuinely contested phase for the first time in years. For most of the Chromebook era, the market was segmented by price and use case in ways that allowed the major platforms to coexist without directly attacking each other's core strengths. Apple owned the premium segment. Google owned the budget education segment. Microsoft occupied the middle with Windows across a wide range of hardware from multiple manufacturers. The MacBook Neo collapsed the segmentation by bringing Apple's performance and build quality to a price that the budget segment cannot ignore. The Googlebook responded by arguing that the Chromebook's successor needs to be reimagined entirely around AI rather than simply repriced to compete. Microsoft's position, which has not included a product announcement that meaningfully responds to either move, is being described in the technology press as performative indifference to the MacBook Neo's arrival, with multiple publications noting that the MacBook Neo appears to be living rent-free in PC competitors' collective heads without Microsoft having an obvious answer ready. The fall of 2026, when the first Googlebooks are scheduled to reach consumers, will determine whether Google's reimagination of its laptop platform arrives with enough execution behind the concept to make the competitive case it is being designed to make. For now, the announcement confirms that Apple's March move changed the conversation, and Google responded with the most ambitious answer it could construct in 2 months. Whether the answer is good enough is a question that the market will spend the rest of 2026 deciding. The sequence of events from March through May 2026 established something more fundamental than a product competition, however. It established that the floor of what counts as an acceptable laptop has been permanently raised in terms of performance and permanently lowered in terms of price, and that the company most responsible for redrawing that line was the one that spent 30 years building a reputation for selling technology only to people who could afford to pay premium prices for it. Apple, at $599, is a different competitive reality for everyone else in the market, and Google's Googlebook announcement is the most visible acknowledgement that the industry is now building its next phase around that new reality rather than the one that existed before March 4th.